I'm an industrial historian, and in the early 80s, I began work for the Massachusetts Historical Commission on a reconnaissance survey, which was a new idea at the time. And we developed a process by which we could look at the history of actually 3 towns in a week and write up that report. And in the late 80s, at a conference of the New York State Preservation League, I happened to meet Joan Davidson, and I was telling her about this project, and indeed a book that had come out of it called A Guide to the Industrial Archaeology of Boston Proper. And she suggested, well, could you write such a book for Columbia County? And at the time, I thought this was a very interesting idea. I knew something about Columbia County because of my family's earlier history here. And I said, well, why not? And on that basis, I began work in the spring of 1989 on looking at each one of the 18 towns in the city of Hudson, and spent about a little over a year working on it. Franklin Ellis is the historian who has really written the most about Columbia County in 1878, and there hasn't really been anything since then. His work was the most detailed up to that time, and it's been a real challenge to fill in the gap since then. Industrial archaeology is the study of past civilizations, past cultures, based on the artifacts of that culture. So it's not simply below ground archaeology. It can also be an above ground appreciation, an above ground study of what survives. So it's an old mill building. It could be even what they call now commercial archaeology, the study of our more recent past, such as diners or motels. And industrial archaeology informs us of our industrial landscape, what survives of the past in the present, and it's a very informative way of telling us, of providing a framework for a community's development. Industrial history provides us with a framework. It provides us with a timeline that shows how a community develops. It's also about what else the community brings with it. It brings with it their culture, their religious beliefs. It's the stores that come along with it. There's a whole culture that industrial history, the economy of the town, explores if you study it from the framework of industrial history. It's more unusual to find an area like this, Columbia County, which seems very green, as a powerhouse of industry, which is now largely ignored and forgotten, which is one of the challenges, one of the interesting things about doing this study. There had always been people interested in the history and development of certain communities, particularly Hudson. And in the 19th century, there were local histories that were done. But it wasn't until the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 that there really was a much more general appreciation of county history. And indeed, after 1876, county histories and local histories were written all across the country, particularly in the Northeast. Usually those histories were published at the request of or financed by subscribers. And that usually characterizes, colors the way the history is presented. So as a result, there are certain things that are going to be left out. And indeed, where there is a little interest in a community, the coverage might be a little bit less. Well, the Industrial Revolution, in fact, came to Columbia County at the very beginning of the 18th century, in 1712, when Germantown was settled. Germantown was a settlement of Palatine, a large number of Palatine immigrants who were brought to this country for the specific purpose of harvesting naval stores. In the late 18th century, the other end of the century, Hudson was founded by a group of Nantucket entrepreneurs who were looking for a deep water port from which they could run their coastwise trade. And Hudson, which at that time was the head of ship navigation, was an ideal location. And so it became a natural mart of trade, as it were, a marketplace. And it was from Hudson that the investment came out to spur a lot of the industrial activity in the rest of the county. Hudson had a tremendous influence on other parts of the county throughout its history, of course, but at the very beginning of the 19th century, in a period of internal improvements, 18 different turnpikes were created. Many of them had the support of Hudson. And if you look at a map of turnpikes in the early 19th century, they spread out like spokes on a wheel. And the coastwise trade itself made Hudson into a tremendously important place. So important that in the 1790s, when the state was looking for a new state capital, Hudson lost by only one vote. The second major transportation innovation of the 19th century were the railroads. And beginning in 1838, with the Hudson and Berkshire Railroad, which connected Hudson with West Stockbridge via Chatham, it was a tremendous opportunity for Hudson to be connected. And following that, by 1860, you had 4 more lines. You have a whole network of transportation routes between the turnpikes and the railroads that really make it possible to link the county in a way it hadn't been linked before. And Columbia County is a little bit unusual to the extent that the geography of it lends itself to a lot of small hamlets, which tend to be quite isolated. And what these transportation routes did was to link those corridors. So you have the development of places like Chatham, the places like Valencia, Philmont, that would otherwise have been relatively isolated. Suddenly they became linked. And there was a will toward connectivity that didn't exist before that. So throughout the 19th and even early in the 20th century, there was this connectivity that existed, which disappeared with the dissolution of the railroads. When the railroads stopped running beginning in the 1930s, there's a real opportunity there for reawakening that connectivity would be extremely useful for the future growth of the county. The landscape has changed over time, but landscape is much more than just the countryside through which we're passing. The landscape are the streetscapes. The landscapes are the mill sites that were extremely active at one point. And how you view the landscape makes a great deal of difference in terms of what you expect from it. And if you don't understand the history of the landscape through which we're passing, you have no reason to preserve the aspects of it that make it different. A landscape is defined by its landmarks. Its landmarks are what make it distinctive. And a landmark isn't simply a church or a famous building. A landmark can be a mill, it can be a mill site. The landmarks are the defining features of the country in which we're looking at. And landmarks can be discussed in themes. You can talk about the landmarks that make up a turnpike, or you can talk about the landmarks of industrial history, because that carries an economic theme that also portrays the history of the community. Whether it's a landmark that has the places of work and the religion that the community has, all of these are important to preserve because they all are part of the cultural landscape in which we live. every community has a unique economic history that can be told through its surviving landmarks and through its landscape. This is why it's so important that this be understood for every community. It's why every community should undertake a study like this, not necessarily in exactly the same form, but so they can recognize and become aware of the landmarks and the landscape around them. And if you forget why a landmark is there, or worse, if you tear it down, part of the landscape disappears because it no longer has a distinction that makes it different from some other part of the county or some other part of the country. So landmarks are important. The homogenization that is taking place is happening because we've lost an appreciation for this landscape. And we need to recognize the aspects of Columbia County that make it distinctive if we want it to remain a distinctive location. There are lots of different ways, but the most important aspect of this is to try and develop the community's awareness of its own landmarks, of its own landscape. And there are as I said, there are lots of different ways. You can use the internet, but you can also use brochures. You can arrange thematic brochures that might look, for instance, at all of the developments along a given turnpike. You could have a whole bicycle trail and tour brochure that talked about everything you saw along it. You could do exhibits. You could have, as some communities already do, heritage days in which you make an effort at once a year or several times a year to actually celebrate the landmarks within that community. And the more you can develop the community's own awareness of its own history, of its own resources, the more they'll say, well, perhaps we should make a bigger effort toward preserving it and recognizing what we have. We sometimes have a tendency to romanticize the past, and this is made very clear by the paintings of the Hudson River School painters, particularly in the last half of the 19th century. But if we look closely at those paintings, they're never quite as romantic or as pastoral as they seem. Columbia County has always had a great deal of economic vitality. There's been a lot of industry here that is obscured by the landscape that we see around us today. And it makes people think sometimes that it's always been this way, but it's not true. It's always been a very active place with a lot of people working in different industries, different ethnic groups that have come to work, whether it's in the textile mills, in the cement plants, or in the brickworks on the river. There's been a lot of activity here for centuries. One of the best ways of interpreting a landscape, of understanding it, is through mapping. Because if you map a landscape, you can actually see the relationships of individual landmarks, individual points of interest to one another and to yourself. And not only that, if you include it, if you give historical dimensions, you can then actually see the landscape in time. And you can do this through a series of overlays. You can present it in a variety of different ways. And now with the new technologies, especially on the web, it's possible to make all of this freely available without much effort. We've actually created a website that allows you to see not only traditional topographic images, but mapping images from Google or from satellite imagery, which shows the location of all of the 134 sites that are mentioned in the book. But there's more opportunities for showing other types of things like railroad routes or turnpikes, which we hope to be able to expand into in the future. There have been a lot of people that have helped me in this project, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible without that help. Virtually every town, there's been a town historian or local people who have contributed their understanding to this book. But I would particularly want to mention the board and staff for the Columbia County Historical Society, who have really been responsible now for pushing it through, and especially to Mike Gladstone, senior editor at Furthermore, who's also been instrumental in making sure that it looks the way it does. And but beyond that, it has a great future, I hope, particularly with young people, in making sure that there's an awareness of the county and its history that continues on into the future. And now with the internet, there's an enormous possibility for expanding this knowledge and for making sure that the tools that are useful to interpreting the landscape, interpreting the landmarks of Columbia County, can be utilized and portray this history in a really exciting and meaningful way.